This is not a story of a rescue from a violent storm, but of a quiet man who learned that the most dangerous frontier was the 20 inches of space between two lonely hearts. It is a story of how the greatest act of courage is not facing a drawn pistol, but in the careful, consensual offering of a hand, in the whispered yes that accepts it. This is how love finds a home, not in grand declarations, but in the lamplight of a kitchen, with vows spoken in plain speech and a promise sealed by the simple mending of a shirt. The silence in Silas Blackwood's house was a well-worn coat, heavy and familiar. He moved through it with the economy of a man who has measured his own loneliness and found it a constant, unchanging thing. As Marshal of Redemption, he was a pillar of the town, but his home was an island. Each evening he would light a single lamp, its glow pushing back the prairie dark, but doing little to warm the empty chair across his table. The floorboards were swept clean, the tin plates washed and stacked, the bed made for one. It was an orderly existence, a fortress built of routine, and inside its walls, Silas was safe from everything but the hollow echo of his own solitary footsteps. He would check the locks on his door, a habit from a life before this one, his eyes scanning the empty street. But the threat was never from the outside. It was in the profound quiet, the stark fact that if he spoke a word aloud, only he would hear it. He often thought a man could die in a house this silent and not be found for days. It was a morbid thought, but a practical one. Silas was a practical man. He did not yearn for company. He had simply forgotten what it felt like. The memory of it was a language he no longer spoke, the words lost to the endless, rustling whisper of the wind against the clapboard. His hands, calloused and capable, knew the weight of his Colt, the grain of an axe handle, the heat of the forge. They did not know the feel of another's touch. Tonight, like all nights, he sat with a book, the pages turning with a soft rustle that was the only conversation in the room. The lamplight caught the silver in his dark hair and carved shadows under a jawline set in stone. He was waiting, though he did not know for what. He was simply enduring the peace he had built, a peace that was beginning to feel indistinguishable from absence. Elara Caine arrived in Redemption with the dry summer heat, a ghost in a worn calico dress. She was the widow of a man the town had deemed a traitor, a freethinker who had spoken against the railroad men and their land grabs. His death had left her not just bereaved, but branded. She walked with a straight-backed pride that defied the whispers that followed her like dust devils. She sought work, but doors closed quietly in her face. She sought lodging, but the boarding house was suddenly full. The town was a fist, closing against her. Silas watched from his office, his face impassive. He saw her dignity, a fragile shield against their scorn. He also saw the encroaching shadow of Amos Harding, a rancher whose wealth had bought him the belief that all things were his for the taking. Harding's eyes followed Elara with a covetous gleam, seeing not a woman, but a stray to be claimed and broken. That evening, Harding cornered her outside the mercantile, his voice a low, proprietary murmur. Silas saw the stiffening of her spine, the subtle flinch she tried to hide. It was then he moved. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed himself between them, a silent, unbreachable wall. "Mr. Harding," he said, his voice level. Harding sneered, but he backed away from the marshal's unblinking gaze. Silas turned to Elara. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a fierce, desperate fire. "Ma'am," he began, his usual clipped tone softening. He saw her exhaustion, the tremor in her hands. The silence of his house rose in his mind, no longer a comfort, but a failing. "This town, it's not a kind place for you right now," he stated, a plain truth. He looked at his own hands, then back at her. "I have a spare room, and a proposal. A practical one." He offered it like a piece of dry timber, no varnish, no polish. A marriage of convenience. His name, his protection, the shelter of his roof. In return, He asked for nothing but her presence to make the arrangement plausible. He expected refusal, outrage. Instead, Elara held his gaze, searching it for traps. She saw none, only a deep, weary honor. "On what terms, Marshal?" she asked, her voice steady. "The terms are yours to set," he said. "The door will have a lock. My word is my bond. You will be safe." She was silent for a long moment, the prairie wind whipping a strand of hair across her face. Then she gave a single sharp nod. "I accept, Marshal Blackwood." In that moment, the silence of his house was broken, not by a sound, but by a promise. The first days were a study in careful distances. Elara moved into the small spare room at the back of the house, a space that had held nothing but stored lumber and dust. She swept it clean herself, refusing his offer of help. She was a quiet presence, a whisper of movement in the rooms he had always occupied alone. Silas found himself holding his breath, listening for the soft tread of her footsteps, the clink of a spoon in the kitchen. The house was no longer just his. He would wake before dawn, his habit, and build the fire in the cook stove, ensuring the chill was gone from the air before she rose. He'd leave a pot of coffee on the warmer, then retreat to his office. He ate his meals at the small table, and she ate hers, a careful hour later. The empty chair was no longer empty, but its occupation was still a question. He learned the rhythm of her days. She was a meticulous worker, turning the small patch of barren ground behind the house into a budding vegetable garden, her hands, surprisingly strong, coaxing life from the hard-packed earth. He watched her from his window, a feeling he couldn't name stirring in his chest. It felt like attention. He was paying attention. One evening, he returned to find the table set for two. A simple stew simmered on the stove, smelling of herbs she'd found on the prairie. He stopped in the doorway. The sight so foreign it momentarily stole his breath. She stood by the stove, her back to him, her shoulders tense. "I used some of the salted pork," she said, not turning. "I hope that was acceptable." "It is," he managed, his voice rough. He hung his gun belt on the peg by the door, a gesture that had become routine, but tonight it felt different. It felt like laying down arms. They ate in their customary silence, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was shared. The space between them was no longer an empty void, but a field of tension, charged with unspoken awareness. He noticed the way she held her fork, the focused line of her brow. She noticed the way he listened to the town's evening sounds, his body still on guard, even at his own table. When the meal was done, he stood to clear the plates. Her hand darted out, not touching him, but stopping him. "I'll do it," she said. "It's my contribution." It was a boundary, a statement of her place in this arrangement. He respected it. He simply nodded, took his book, and sat in his chair by the lamp. But he didn't read. He listened to the soft sounds of her washing the dishes, the gentle scrape and splash of a home being tended. The silence was changing its shape. Silas was a man whose life left its marks on his clothing. A frayed cuff from leaning on his desk, a snag from a bramble bush on patrol, a small tear near the shoulder from a scuffle he'd broken up by the saloon. He paid them no mind, wearing his shirts until they were thin as paper. One afternoon, he came home to find Elara sitting in the main room's only comfortable chair, a needle and thread in her hand. One of his shirts was draped across her lap. He stopped, feeling like an intruder. The sight of her, so calmly engaged in such an intimate act of domesticity, was disarming. The needle moved with a swift, sure rhythm, a small silver fish darting through the rough blue cotton. She looked up, her work stilled. "I found it in the washing pile," she explained, her tone neutral, a simple statement of fact. The seam was coming undone. He didn't know what to say. No one had mended his clothes since his mother, decades ago. He simply stood there, watching her fingers guide the thread, closing the small gap in the fabric with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. It felt like she was mending something more than cloth. She was stitching a small tear in the fabric of his solitude. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. She merely nodded, her focus returning to her work. He sat at the table, ostensibly to clean his pistol, but his gaze kept drifting to her. The lamplight softened the lines of her face, catching the warm tones in her brown hair. He saw the faint scar above her eyebrow, the determined set of her mouth. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, not as the town's pariah or the object of his protection, but as the woman who sat in his house, mending his shirt. When she was finished, she bit the thread and held the shirt up for inspection. The repair was perfect. She folded it neatly and set it on the edge of the table without a word. Later, when he went to his room, he picked it up. The cotton was still faintly warm from her hands. He ran his thumb over the new seam. It was strong and smooth, a quiet act of care, a gesture that asked for nothing in return. It was a language he was beginning to understand, a dialect of service and quiet attention, he spoke himself. In that moment, a slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove, and everything to do with the woman in the next room. The summer heat broke with a series of furious, chilling rainstorms that turned the streets of Redemption to mud and rattled the window panes in Silas' small house. The world outside shrank, and the world within the clapboard walls grew larger, more intense. The damp cold seeped through the floors, and Silas found himself piling extra blankets on Elara's cot, a silent offering he'd leave while she was tending her garden. But it wasn't enough. He would hear her cough in the night, a small, dry sound through the thin wall that separated their rooms. He would lie awake, listening, his protective instincts warring with his deep-seated respect for her boundaries. One night, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to creep through every crack in the house. He couldn't hear her cough, but he could feel the cold as if it were his own. He rose from his bed, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and stood before her closed door. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. This was a line he had sworn not to cross. He lowered his hand, his fist clenching. He could not order her. He could only ask. He knocked softly once. A moment passed, then the quiet shuffle of her feet. The door opened a crack, her silhouette framed against the darkness of her room. "Marshal?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "The cold," he said, his own voice a low rasp. "It's significant." He didn't look at her, but at the floor between them. "My bed is large enough for two, with space between. It would be warmer." The proposal hung in the air, stark and vulnerable. He was not offering passion. He was offering body heat, a practical solution to a practical problem. He was offering a piece of his final sanctuary. "You would be safe," he added, the words a solemn vow. "I would expect nothing." He finally met her eyes in the gloom. He saw her surprise, her caution, and something else, a flicker of understanding. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, considering his words not as a proposition, but as the treaty they were. "Only for warmth," she stated, her voice quiet but firm. It was not a question, but a term. "Only for warmth," he confirmed. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She followed him into his room, a shadow behind his shadow. He climbed into his side of the bed, turning his back to give her privacy, and lay rigidly still, staring at the wall. He heard the soft rustle as she lay down on the opposite edge, the dip of the mattress. The space between them felt a mile wide and charged with lightning. For a long time, neither of them moved, their breathing the only sound in the room. It was the most profound intimacy he had ever known. To share a bed, even for warmth, was to learn another person's geography. Silas learned that Elara slept on her side, curled into a defensive posture that only softened as the night deepened and the chill receded. Elara learned that Silas, even in sleep, was preternaturally still, a man accustomed to keeping watch. The first few nights were fraught with a tense awareness, each of them clinging to their edge of the mattress. But slowly, imperceptibly, the chasm between them narrowed. One morning, Silas awoke to find her hand resting on the blanket near his, her fingers lax in sleep. He lay motionless, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace, his gaze fixed on the quiet intimacy of the sight. He committed to memory the shape of her knuckles, the slight fraying on her cuff. It was a more potent image than any kiss he could imagine. The shared warmth bled into their waking hours. The silence at the breakfast table became less a void and more a comfortable quiet. He found himself watching for the small, unguarded smile that would touch her lips when one of her seedlings finally sprouted, or when the cat from the saloon left a mouse on their doorstep as a gift. He started speaking her name. Not Mrs. Caine, but Elara. The first time he said it, asking if she wanted more coffee, the word felt heavy and significant in his mouth. She looked up, startled, and a faint blush rose on her cheeks. "Yes, Silas," she replied, her own use of his first name, a quiet acceptance, a step across a previously unseen line. The house began to feel like a shared territory. Her shawl was sometimes draped over the back of his chair. His books found their way to the small table beside her cot, where she now sat to read in the evenings. One day he came home to find she had replaced a broken pane of glass in the kitchen window, her handiwork neat and sure. "The wind was getting through," she said simply. He looked at the clear glass, at the way the afternoon sun now streamed into the room, and felt a gratitude so profound it almost hurt. She wasn't just living in his house. She was helping to build it, to make it a true shelter. This partnership, forged in silence and small gestures, was becoming more real to him than the legal document filed away in his desk. He was no longer just her protector. He was becoming her partner. And the thought, once terrifying, now felt like coming home. Amos Harding did not take kindly to being denied. He saw Silas's protection of Elara not as an act of honor, but as a claim of ownership he intended to contest. He chose his moment in the center of town, with a dozen witnesses pretending not to listen. He blocked Elara's path as she left the mercantile, his bulk imposing, his smile a predator's grimace. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, drawing the name out with a sneering emphasis. "Or is it still Mrs. Caine? I confess, the town is confused about your marshal's intentions." Elara stood her ground, her basket of goods held like a shield. "My name is my own business, Mr. Harding." Before Harding could reply, Silas was there. He moved with a quiet swiftness that was more unnerving than any loud threat. He did not touch Harding. He simply stood beside Elara, a solid, calming presence. His gaze on the rancher was flat and cold. "Is there a problem here?" Silas asked, his voice low. Harding's eyes flickered from Silas to Elara, a calculated insult in the sweep. "Just wondering when you plan to be done with her, Marshal. A woman like that. She's not suited for a man of the law. Once you've had your fill, I'd be happy to take her off your hands." The air grew thick and still. Elara flinched, the insult landing like a physical blow. Silas's hand moved, not towards his gun, but to rest lightly on the small of Elara's back. It was a gesture of pure, possessive support, a silent declaration. "She is not a piece of property, Harding," Silas said, each word precise and sharp as a shard of glass. "She is my wife, and you will address her as such, or you and I will have a conversation in my office from which you will not enjoy the outcome." His eyes held Harding's, and the rancher, for all his bluster, was the first to look away. He muttered a curse and shoved past them, his arrogance curdling into resentment. Silas didn't watch him go. His attention was entirely on Elara. He felt the tremor running through her under his hand. He kept his hand there, a steadying weight, until he felt the trembling subside. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice for her alone. She nodded, though her face was pale. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw not just gratitude, but a dawning trust that went deeper than any they had shared before. In public, before the eyes of the town, he had not just defended her. He had claimed her as his own, not in ownership, but in partnership. That night, the house was quiet, but the silence was different. It was heavy with the residue of the afternoon's confrontation. Elara prepared their meal, her movements stiff and precise. Silas sat at the table, oiling a rifle, the rhythmic scrape of the cloth on steel the only sound. The unspoken tension stretched between them until it was a tangible thing. Finally, as the lamplight cast long shadows across the floor, she spoke, her back to him. "My first husband, John, he was a good man," she began, her voice low. "But he saw the world in stark terms. Right and wrong. He couldn't abide the quiet thievery of the railroad agents, the way they bullied settlers off their land with false claims. He wrote letters. He spoke at meetings. They called him a radical. A rebel." She turned, her hands clasped before her. "When he died of fever, it was a relief to them. It made me an inconvenience, a reminder of a man they wanted to forget. Harding sees me as a loose thread, something to be tidied up or unraveled completely." She finally looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I am not a piece of property." Silas set the rifle down, his full attention on her. The lamplight caught the fierce, vulnerable pride in her eyes. "I know," he said softly. He felt a need to offer a piece of himself in return, to balance the weight of her confession. "Before I was a marshal here, I was a soldier," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There was an ambush. My commanding officer, he made a bad call. I saw it coming, but I didn't speak up. I was young, trained to follow orders. Men died who didn't have to. Good men." He looked down at his own hands, as if seeing the phantom stains of that failure. "I left the army. I came here, to a place where the law was simple, where I could see a problem and fix it directly, where I could protect people. It was an atonement." He looked up, meeting her gaze across the small kitchen. "I won't fail to protect someone again." In that shared moment of vulnerability, the last wall between them crumbled. They were no longer just a marshal and his ward, or a husband and wife in name only. They were two survivors, scarred by their pasts, who had found an unlikely harbor in each other. The air was thick with unspoken longing, a desire not just for the body, but for the soul. Amos Harding's final move was one of cowardly bureaucracy. He couldn't best Silas in a direct confrontation, so he went to the town council, a group of timid merchants who owed him money or feared his influence. He invoked a forgotten town charter clause about morally unmoored individuals, citing Elara's late husband as politics, and her own unseemly arrangement with the marshal, as proof that she was a corrupting influence. He demanded a hearing to have her legally expelled from the town limits. The meeting was held in the cramped town hall, the air thick with dust and hypocrisy. Elara stood before the council, her hands clasped, her back ramrod straight. Silas stood a half step behind her and to her right, not as her defender, but as her ally. He had offered to speak for her, but she had refused. "This is my name they're soiling, Silas. I will be the one to clean it." He had simply nodded, his pride in her a fierce, burning thing. Harding laid out his case with oily self-righteousness. When he finished, the council chairman, a man named Peters, looked at Elara. "Mrs. Blackwood, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Elara stepped forward. Her voice did not tremble. "My late husband was an honest man who believed in the law more than Mr. Harding believes in his own ledger. I have conducted myself with quiet dignity in this town, despite the welcome you have offered. I have broken no laws. My only crime, it seems, is to exist in a way that Mr. Harding finds inconvenient." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the council members. "You speak of morality. Is it moral to cast out a widow?" Is it moral to allow a wealthy man to use this counsel to settle a personal vendetta? Then she turned her head slightly, her eyes finding Silas. A silent question passed between them, a transfer of strength. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. She had this. Peters cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze. He looked at Silas. "Marshal, this is a town matter. Your personal involvement complicates things. What exactly is your stake in this?" Silas didn't look at the council. He looked only at Elara, his voice clear and steady in the silent room. A vow made not to them, but to her. "She is my wife." He let the words settle, simple and absolute. "This is her home, and anyone who tries to remove her from it will answer to me. Not as the marshal, as her husband." The finality in his tone was irrefutable. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, solid as bedrock. The partnership between them was a visible force in the room, in the line of his shoulders, in the pride of her stance, in the unwavering eye contact that bound them together. Harding saw it, and for the first time he looked truly defeated. The council, cowed and shamed, mumbled amongst themselves and dismissed the petition. The choice had been made, not by them, but by the two people standing before them as one. The walk home was silent. The adrenaline from the confrontation ebbed away, leaving a fragile, tremulous quiet in its place. The moment the door of their house clicked shut behind them, sealing them away from the town, the tension in Elara's shoulders seemed to release all at once. She swayed, a deep, shuddering breath escaping her lips. Silas was there, his hands coming up to grip her upper arms, steadying her. "Easy," he murmured. He led her to a chair and knelt before her, his gaze searching her face. Her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. He gently took one of her hands in his. "You were brave," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was terrified," she whispered, the admission a crack in her composure. She turned her hand over in his, revealing 4 small, crescent-shaped indentations in her palm where her nails had dug in. One of them had broken the skin, a tiny bead of blood welling up. Without a word, Silas rose and went to the washstand. He returned with a clean cloth and a basin of warm water. He knelt again and carefully, gently, began to clean the small wound. His touch was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the calloused roughness of his skin. He worked with a focused, silent reverence, his head bowed over her hand. The simple, domestic act of aftercare was more intimate than any embrace. It was a mending, a soothing of a hurt inflicted by the world outside these walls. When he was done, he wrapped a small strip of clean linen around her palm. He didn't release her hand. He just held it, his thumb stroking softly over her wrist, feeling the frantic pulse begin to slow. "It's over," he said. "You're safe here." She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know," she said. The truth of it settled into the room, warm and solid as the lamplight. He had made this house a sanctuary, and she had made it a home. He rose and went to the pantry, returning not with a bottle of whiskey, but with a piece of bread and a small wedge of cheese. He sat opposite her and broke the bread in 2, handing her a piece. They ate in the quiet glow of the lamp, the simple meal a sacrament. He fed her a piece of cheese from his fingers, and she accepted it, their eyes meeting over the small, profound gesture. The storm had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, they were simply 2 people in a kitchen, sharing food, mended and whole. Later that evening, as the fire in the stove burned down to glowing embers, Silas retrieved the simple, handwritten document from the locked box where he kept his important papers. It was their marriage agreement, a dry and practical contract outlining the terms of their convenience. He walked over to where Elara sat by the hearth, her sewing idle in her lap. He held the paper out to her. She looked from it to his face, a question in her eyes. "This was a practical arrangement," he said, his voice low and steady. But it is no longer just practical for me, Elara. He knelt before her, the paper held between them. I don't want you to stay because this paper says you must. I want you to stay because you choose to, because this is your home, and because I hope you might want to share it with me. Truly. He offered the paper to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. She read the words they had both agreed to weeks ago, words that now seemed like a relic from another lifetime. Then, without hesitation, she reached out and fed it to the embers in the stove. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The contract was gone, replaced by something unwritten and infinitely stronger. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a button, carved from a piece of dark, polished wood. It was simple, shaped like a 5-petaled prairie flower, its surface worn smooth. I'm not a man for jewelry, he said, his gaze fixed on the small token in his palm. But I made this. I thought, your coat is missing a button. He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. Stay, Elara. It wasn't a command or a plea. It was an invitation. The simplest, most profound vow he could make. A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She reached out, her fingers closing around his, covering the wooden button. Yes, she whispered. The word was a promise. Yes, Silas, I'll stay. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The rhythms of the house, once so new and deliberate, settled into a comfortable, unspoken cadence. Silas no longer woke to an empty home. He woke to the scent of coffee already brewing, to the quiet presence of Elara moving in the kitchen. His habit of scanning rooms for threats had transformed. Now his eyes sought her first, not for danger, but for need, for a smile, for the simple comfort of her being there. Her garden flourished, and their table was filled with the fruits of her labor. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft sounds of a shared life. The murmur of their voices in the evening, the snip of her scissors as she sewed, the solid thud of his boots on the porch. One afternoon he came home to find her on a small ladder, stretching to hang new curtains she had sewn for the main room's window. They were a cheerful yellow, the color of prairie sunflowers. The sight stopped him in his tracks. She was literally letting the light in, changing the very atmosphere of the space he had hidden in for so long. He went to her, his hands finding her waist to steady her on the ladder. She looked down, a soft smile on her lips. I thought the room needed more sun, she said. It did, he agreed, his voice thick. His hands didn't leave her waist, and she didn't move away. They stood like that for a long moment, bathed in the new, golden light streaming through the window. This was their home, a place they had built not with timber and nails, but with quiet vows, careful consent, and 1,000 small gestures of tenderness. He looked around the room, at her sewing basket by the fire, at the 2 mugs set side by side on the kitchen counter, at the woman in his arms. The loneliness he had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. He had found his redemption, not in his marshal's star, but in the steadfast heart of the rebel widow his town wouldn't claim, and in the quiet, extraordinary love they had built together.